Hello, everyone. I'm Rhoda Bernard coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts, USA, and it's my pleasure to present this session on assessment at the intersection of music education, special education, and disability studies. Here's our agenda for the session. We're going to talk first about how the field of music education, special education, and disability studies is an intersectional field by its very nature. And when we think about assessment of music learning by disabled students, we need to think of it on three levels: at the level of the field, at the level of a program, perhaps, and then at the level of an individual music educator in a teaching and learning setting. We're going to consider those three levels through models of assessment practice from different places around the world. We'll look at Drake Music Scotland and the work that they're doing. We'll look at my organization, the Berkeley Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs, and our work. And we'll look at Gersh Academy in Puerto Rico and the work that they're doing. Finally, we will summarize and give some implications and lessons for the field. So when you think about music education for disabled students, in, of course, the context of arts education, there is this intersectional field that I mentioned. And I've been fortunate in my role at Berkeley to convene and facilitate the work of a leadership network for arts education and special needs that has been meeting for over 3 years. These are leaders in the field representing multiple art forms that do all different kinds of work. And we get together for peer learning sessions, for projects and conversations, for presentations and sharing best practices. And we've done a bunch of different kinds of projects together, all with the aim of moving this field forward. One of our earliest projects was to map the field, and we created a field guide for arts and special education. Now, I know our conversations at this conference are about music education, but of course, music education lives within this larger field of the arts and special education. And as I spoke about, there's that intersection, right, between arts education and disability studies and special education, right? But there are other intersections and other aspects of the fields that lay over each other and that relate to each other when you think about the field as a whole. And that's what we tried to put together through a lot of activities and work to create the field guide. So this very complex diagram shows the complexity of the field. And there are some important things to mention about how the diagram is put together. Excuse me. First, in the center, we have students with disabilities, right? So they are positioned at the center for a reason. They are the focus of the work. They are why we do what we do. They are what matters most for all aspects of the work. Then we have the three large circles that are filled in with a color, and they represent three important areas of this work. And the pink circle is arts and culture communities. So what happens outside of school settings in the community in arts and culture. The circle that's filled in with green is about education and schools, what happens in those settings. And then the circle that's filled in blue is about the disability justice movement and what that has to say about this work. Looking at those three and how they come together for students with disabilities, we then see these concentric rings that are parts of all three of those circles. Going from the inside out, after the students with disabilities, we have all the different people that are a part of the work. Then we have all the different experiences that take place through this work. Then we have the outcomes that are desired and that actually take place through this work. And then we have the systems, and there are a wide range of systems that are involved in this work. So if we just look at these concentric circles, again, arts learners with disabilities at the center, just looking at two of them, if we think about people, some of the people that are involved here are teaching artists, teachers, families, peers, community members, caregivers, support professionals. You get the idea. There's a wide range of actors involved in this work. Another circle that we looked at more specifically here has to do with the various systems. So there are systems that involve philanthropy, school systems, arts and culture community, public policy, research, related services, healthcare, business, and the private sector. So this is highly intersectional work on multiple levels. And something that I think this piece of the diagram shows. And if you look at each of the filled in circles in more depth, right? So when we come to education in schools, there are teachers, when we think about people, there are arts, instruction and integration, and participation and engagement when it comes to experiences. For outcomes, students need to demonstrate knowledge, they are learning content, they are gaining skills. There's more we could say here, of course. And systems, we have the K-12 schools, we have specialized schools, we have colleges and universities. We could go on even further from there. I think you're getting the idea of how this gets filled in. When we think about the arts and culture communities, arts practitioners are the people, artistic creation and cultural experiences, right? Outcomes, create art, express oneself, connect to others, systems, cultural and funding policies, corporate and nonprofit cultural institutions, and creative industries. So that's a little sampling on that track. And then if we look at disability justice, we have support professionals, therapies, inclusive design, disability advocacy for experiences, decreased barriers, increased support, individual autonomy as some sample outcomes, health and well-being, adaptive technologies, and support services as some sample systems. Putting it all together, we come back to the full field guide diagram. I'm not at all saying that these particular items that I just read are all that's included here. It's really sort of, here are some examples. We could certainly fill in dozens more items, but it's really to give the idea of the complexity of the layers of intersectionality that are taking place in this diagram between systems, between people who are acting, between different goals and outcomes and experiences. So to think about this on an international level, we just recently started to convene the International Arts Education and Disability Justice Exchange. And I and my organization are the convener and facilitator. We're bringing together now international leaders in the field who are doing work in arts education and disability justice in some way. These are quarterly meetings, and at the meetings, one person presents their work in their context, and the presenter gets to determine the meeting time, so they get the best time zone, and the rest of us have to adapt. And then there's discussion, sharing of best practices, and a chance for us to get to know one another. We are hoping that this group will eventually start working on collaborative projects to bring best practices beyond national borders and to move the field forward on an international level. This is really important, of course, for arts education and music education. And of course, this pre-conference seminar is a wonderful place where this kind of exchange is happening for music education internationally. So when we think about assessment at the level of the field, when it comes to music education, the field of music education, particularly as I know it in the US, has a long way to go when it comes to, I believe, assessment generally speaking, but in particular, assessment for the populations that we care about. So there's, until relatively recently, maybe the last 15 or 20 years, there was a lot of resistance in music education to assessment, saying, oh, wait a minute, music education is about being creative. How can we possibly assess that? That sort of thing. Thanks to the work of Tim Brophy, who has convened numerous international assessment in music education conferences and others, assessment has taken on a more robust profile in the field of music education in the last 15 or 20 years. Where I think we need some help is on how to better assess students with disabilities and diagnoses in music education contexts. people want a one-size-fits-all assessment. And we all know that teaching and learning with these students is not one-size-fits-all, nor should assessment be. So the challenge for music education, I think, is to move beyond a standardized one-size-fits-all assessment to really bring the assessment to the student and where they are. When we think about special education is a field in the US that has some research-based assessment tools. They have a wide range of them. And some of them, I think, do hold promise for music educators. I am by no means saying that music educators should take data and become behavioral analysts. I'm not looking at that. I am looking at, however, that special education as a field has been assessing students with disabilities for a long time, and there is some wonderful research in some promising practices that could have benefits for music education. So some of the tools we may not be able to adopt wholesale, but with some adaptations, they could be effective tools for music educators. And the fact that it's not one size fits all, I think, is super, super important. And it's something that is better understood, I believe, in the special education field. Then we need to think about disability studies. And this is where, in the US, music education needs some work. So right now, most music teacher education programs give fairly limited opportunities for pre-service music educators to learn about teaching and learning with students with disabilities to begin with, never mind assessment. And that the opportunities they get are usually a course where they get a lot of history and a lot of acronyms. Not a whole lot of hands-on experience, fairly often is the case, and very little contact with disability studies and the ideas of disability studies and disability justice. So I believe that pre-service music teacher education in the US needs to incorporate more of the concepts of disability studies, such as models of disability. Our students should understand the medical model, the social model, the affirmative model, and so forth, to really have a broader understanding of what disability can mean and has meant, and how important those perspectives are in terms of where the barriers are for our people with disabilities with whom we work. I also think that there are opportunities to understand your own perspective in relation to disability studies and disability justice. And there are folks who have created wonderful tools. Leah Lakshmi has created some fantastic tools that organizations, educators, and programs can use to help assess, where am I in various aspects of disability justice? Where are the gaps in my knowledge and understanding? How can I address those? Where are my strengths? How can I, capitalize on those? I think there's a lot of reflection and a lot of work. And then, like I said, some reform that needs to happen so that music teacher educators can help pre-service teachers to really think deeply about these issues. I see an opportunity for breaking down a silo here between teacher education and disability studies in our university settings to make that possible. So what I'd like to do now is look at some models to help us think about how this plays out in practice. The first model we're going to look at is Drake Music Scotland. And I am grateful to Pete Sparks, who you can see in the bottom right photograph on this slide, for his generosity around these slides. Pete and I gave a presentation on assessment for students with disabilities at the World Alliance for Arts Education conference about a year ago. And with his permission, I'm using a couple of the slides and speaking about Drake Music Scotland. Many of you are familiar with this organization. They are an arts organization. Their major activities, they are a busy, very active organization, but their major activities involve performances and recordings of new music, a lot of work with technology and innovations, music education, and skills and training. And they see their impact on 3 dimensions: that musical skills are developed in the students, that confidence and self-belief are developed, and that social skills and increased independence are developed. And talking with Pete about Drake Music Scotland and assessment, The first place he goes is to the second and third of these impact bullets. So he talks about, I don't teach music, I teach confidence, is a quote from Richard Michael of the Kingdom of Fife in Scotland. And at Drake Music Scotland, what they notice right away with the students is how their confidence increases, how their self-efficacy increases. This is not a small thing. As many folks have written about and studied, this is a really necessary and important aspect of music and arts education for all students, and for our students with disabilities particularly. This is very powerful. There are not very many teaching and learning settings where students with disabilities feel confident and empowered. Music can be one of them, and that is a profound impact that we can have. And it needs to be elevated in terms of assessment to the same level as musical skill development, right? In my view, growing someone's confidence is equally as important, perhaps even more important, as where their musical skill level is progressing. So that's an important turn that we need to take with assessment. When it comes to using an established framework for musical skill assessment, Drake Music Scotland turns to the Sounds of Intent framework, Adam Ockelford's work, which is laid out here. Many of you are familiar with this work. Adam Ockelford has put together the Sounds of Intent framework as a way to map how a young person or person of any age interacts with sound, how they make meaning of it, how they create it, how they respond to it. And there are different dimensions for that mapping, and you can trace progress over time. I strongly recommend his book and looking into the Sounds of Intent framework if you haven't. It is a way to evaluate students on multiple dimensions in a longitudinal format that has some standardization across students. So that can be very, very helpful. At my own organization, the Berkeley Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs, we do a bunch of different work, but for the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to focus on our direct service arts education programs. We serve about 300 people every week in a wide range of music programming. I think there are 13 music programs, 2 adaptive dance programs, and a couple of theater programs. And that work looks something like this. You can see some photos of some of our programs. We've got rock band and music class for young children and private music lessons, and our daytime Moon Creations theater program represented here. We have a wide range of programming, and I'm not going to get into those specifics for the purposes of today's discussion. You can find us on the web. How do we deal with assessment? First of all, our programs are community programs. They are not credit-bearing courses. They are not K-12 education. They are community arts education. Most of our work takes place on Saturdays. The other important distinction is that we offer arts education, not arts therapy. I don't need to explain to this audience the difference and the wonderful connections and similarities and synergies between the two fields, but it's important for the purpose of thinking about assessment. We have a very nice instructor-student ratio. So we give over 100 private lessons a week. And of course, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. But even in groups, it's one instructor is never ratioed to more than 5 students. So 1 to 5 is the highest. It's often 1 to 3 or 1 to 2. So there's a lot of individualization and customization in how we teach and in how we assess. We use ongoing assessments to help differentiate instruction and also to incorporate elements of universal design for learning that are going to be effective for individual students. We receive our funding from tuition from the families who participate, but we also raise money through foundation grants, government grants, and individual donors. A great deal of the money we raise is used to provide tuition assistance for families who can't afford it. We have never had to turn away a family from our programs because they can't afford it, and that's something we're very proud of. So we receive a lot of external funding. The issue there, of course, is that our funders require written formal assessments. So what do? Pre and post rubrics on a semester basis. So we give a rubric at the beginning of the semester and the same rubric at the end of the semester, and we track progress on a semester by semester basis. In this way, the assessment is meeting the students, not the other way around. The students are not being assessed against some norm or standard. Rather, we are measuring where they are and how they progress. There's no expectation of what progress looks like, because, as I don't need to tell you all, for our populations, learning journeys look differently, progress is expressed differently. So we also assess students on their artistic skills and on aspects of their behavioral skills, particularly in group programs and classes. And we are very focused on increasing the level of student independence. We would like the students to become more and more independent. Our rubrics are qualitative and quantitative. And the challenge for us has been to maintain inter-rater reliability. Our teaching staff is growing. We launched what is now a permanent virtual arm for our programs during the pandemic. We have a whole new cadre of instructors who only teach online. We've got to make sure that the rubrics and the ratings are reliable across instructors. We do a lot of work on that, and it's an ongoing process. And every time we add new instructors, we've got to go back to the inter-rater reliability drawing board. So that is definitely a challenge. Here are some excerpts from a sample rubric. So this is one for our private music lessons program. And we call our rubrics progress reports because we share them with the families, we share them with our funders, we keep records of them as well. So the components are done in a Google form, and there are various components that of the students' musicianship or musical ability that are evaluated here. Note that there are 4 dimensions to the rubric. I am a big fan of even numbers of rubric dimensions, because if you have an odd number, a lot of folks are going to pick the middle value. So if it were 1 through 5, there'd be a whole lot of 3s. Here, you've got to decide, is it a 2? Is it a 3? You've got to pick one side of the middle. And I think that lends to more meaningful data. We then have qualitative comments for every element as well that the instructors fill in. So we use those rubrics, as I said, at the beginning and the end of each semester. We keep track of progress. We keep track of descriptive statistics of the rubric data, and we report on that to our funders. The third organization that I wanted to highlight is Gersh Academy in Puerto Rico. Gersh Academy is actually a consortium of independent schools for people ages 5 to 21 with autism. There are a couple of Puerto Rico locations. I'm connected to the one that's located in San Juan, and they have a very strong music program as part of their curriculum. The schools in Puerto Rico are bilingual schools. So Gersh Academy thinks a whole lot about independence. And this is a slide that Pete prepared that I think is a wonderful slide about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So Lev Vygotsky, one of his major contributions to educational psychology and theory is this notion of the zone of proximal development. So if you think about, and I love these concentric circles, in the center, what can the learner do by themselves, independently, without assistance, right? That's the inner circle. And then the outermost circle is the red circle, what the learner cannot do, right? And then the middle circle is what the learner can do if they have assistance. This is the zone of proximal development, the zone of where the person is next about to grow. With just the right amount of assistance, the learner can do a bit more, right? The example I often give is myself when I took golf lessons. When I took golf lessons, I could hit the ball straight, but I could not hit it very far on myself. So by myself, I could hit it straight, but not super far. When my golf teacher would assist me, help me with more follow through, give me a, help me with the swing so the club head was swinging harder and faster, I could get the ball to travel much farther. That's what I was able to do with assistance. And of course, by myself, I could not get the ball to travel that much farther. So that's my zone of proximal development when it came to golf. For our students, that assistance is super important. And we want to provide that assistance to help the students achieve more and then gradually fade that assistance so that the student can become more independent. And now they can do what they could do before, plus what we were assisting them with, and we move them through the next zone, right? So one way that Gersh does this in their rubrics is something that I really like. It's like a double overlaid rubric. So this is a drum set assessment. And the idea is that there are skills that each student needs to accomplish on the drum set. But rather than just say, check, the student can do this, or minus, the student cannot, what is the level of independence at which the student can do it? So the numbers in there will correspond to these levels. So for example, the first student in the top row can match the color on the drum by playing it on each drum at level 2. They can do it, but with a lot of help and prompting. And that same student can play color patterns on the drum set, but only at level 1. They showed interest and tried it. Another student, say, in the second grouping of students, the top row, is at level 4 in that first skill. They do it independently, but inconsistently. So it's not just what can you do, it's how independent are you in what you're doing. This kind of double whammy rubric, I think, is extremely effective for our students in particular, because we want to pay such close attention to independence. So what can we learn from all of this and take away for the field? Assessment for disabled students needs a different conceptualization of assessment. We are not assessing against a norm. Rather, we are meeting the students where they are and measuring their progress over time. That's a really important concept, and it's different from what we see, particularly in schools where there's often a one-size-fits-all approach. And this is where special education in some of their differentiated assessment practices can benefit us and could be a very helpful collaboration for us. Assessment for disabled students should address skills, but also independence, as we've talked about. That's a really important thing. We want our students to be independent, and that's an aspect of assessment that isn't normally and regularly thought about in most settings. We need that. As you all know, our learning journeys that we see with our disabled students are unique for all sorts of reasons. Learning doesn't play out in what might seem to be a straightforward fashion. It is a different kind of learning journey. And so because of that, we need to meet the student where they are, and we need to understand their journey and be able to pull back and see the whole journey as we're working with our students. And then this idea that Pete brought to the fore about teaching confidence through positive reinforcement and specific praise, and really seeing each individual student, recognizing their unique potential, their unique achievements, and their unique gifts. That is something that we want to do with every student we encounter in any setting, for sure. But for our students with disabilities and diagnoses, it's even more critical for them to be seen in this way, and for them to develop this confidence, and for that development of confidence to be something that we incorporate in our assessments. And I want to push the field to do that. So I would like to thank you all for your time and attention. It's been a great pleasure putting this together for you. Here is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me if there are any questions, or if you'd like to continue this discussion. And I'm looking forward to seeing many more presentations on the conference over the next few days. Thank you.